I am very surprised that most of my friends and most people I know, I meet, don't know what's happening in West Papua. So I think it's really great that we can present it here today at our wonderful Bellingen Memorial Hall. So shining a light on what's going on. So West Papua, as you probably know, is the western side of the world's largest tropical island, first called Papua and then later called New Guinea. The eastern side was eventually an Australian territory which got independence, and the western side was a Dutch territory up until 1962. So I'll be running through the history and what happened and why the West Papuan people did not get their rightful independence, and then what's been happening in West Papua since the Indonesian occupation. So I dedicate this presentation to one of my dear friends, one of the local OPM Brigadier Generals. His name is Alifi Lamak Tablo, and he was so kind to take me through his territory in 2022 and 2023 and meet me in Papua New Guinea in 2024, so I could detail his life and the life of some of his comrades. Unfortunately, just before Christmas, he was killed by one of Indonesia's drones. The Indonesian military, basically too afraid to come on the ground and fight the West Papuans on their own soil, even though most of them just use bows and arrows. So what they're resorting to now is helicopter gunships, drones and strafing, as well as a lot of other methods of killing. So West Papua is actually, or the island of Papua, is actually part of the Australian greater continent. We were joined together without sea for 55 million years until the last interglacial. When the glaciers started melting, that created the Arafura Sea and what's today's Torres Strait. And that was only 8,000 years ago. So for the greater part of the occupation of our indigenous ancestors, we were one continent. We arrived through West Papua. That was across the Wallace Line. Only humans are able to cross that line with dogs. And the Europeans, of course, sliced up their territory as they went around the world claiming other people's territory. And the Dutch claimed West Papua in 1824. They just put a line on a map and claimed the western side. They already had the Netherlands East Indies, which was the jewel in their crown. It was richer, in fact, than the British India Company. And that's where the Dutch got all of their wealth, was out of the archipelago. West Papua is part of Melanesia, which makes up Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Kanaki, New Caledonia, and even up towards East Timor. They are First Nations people, as of course are the people in this country. And they live in a beautiful, harmonious way of life with nature. They don't destroy nature, they live within nature. It's home to some of the most remarkable flora and fauna in the world. This is probably one of the most beautiful birds I've seen. It's the blue crowned pigeon, and it is the symbol of West Papua. Now this is the earliest ethnographic research was by a Russian of all people. He came down on a Russian frigate, had the Navy drop him off on the north coast of Papua, and he lived alongside the local people for 15 months. He learnt the local language, he became part of the community, he lived in a local house, and within about 12 months, the people didn't want him to leave. They fell in love with him, he got on well with everyone, and being typical Melanesians, they opened their heart to him. And what he describes in his diary is the first written records, if you like, of the early Papuan life. So what he describes is that people had their own local self-governance. They didn't have a government, they didn't have state, they didn't have a public service, they didn't have police, but they had been living in harmony with nature and harmony with each other for 50,000 years. And preeminence, an ethnographic term, which is what makes someone special or makes someone respected. In Melanesian culture, it's based on reciprocity and it's based on gift giving. And more often than not, there's no notion of reciprocity. So people give for the sake of giving. And as I discovered when I travelled through the Solomons and Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, never tell someone that you like something, otherwise they'll give it to you. 1936 was the next major European impact in West Papua. It was a Dutch colony, as I mentioned, but in 1936 the Dutch only administered 5% of the territory. 95% of the people had never seen a white person, didn't know what administration was. So even though the Dutch claim it as a non-self-governing territory, in reality on the ground, the people were still self-governing. But in 1936, the Rockefellers, one of their corporations, sent a team of geologists over there looking for minerals, and they discovered the world's largest gold deposit, but they kept the discovery hidden until the 1960s, after America had basically put in Suharto, the dictator. The World War II came along, and the Papuan people were our greatest allies. My grandfather and my great uncles, my grandmother's brothers, they were all over on the Kokoda Trail, up in Wewak, and in West Papua they were also fighting alongside the Australians and the Dutch. The Dutch evacuated West Papua and came to Australia, but some stayed on, and one of them was this young Dutch man, De Bruyn, and he, with 19 other Papuans, formed the Oak Tree Party, and they would go on guerrilla raids attacking the Japanese behind enemy lines, locating the Japanese and then relaying their positions back to Australia. So when the Allies came in, they knew where the Japanese were. So they should be considered, in my mind, as part of the Anzacs or part of the Western Allies. They gave their lives for our country. And according to the Coast Watchers, without the Papuans there wouldn't have been a Coast Watchers, as they were the ones guiding us, carrying all our gear, building our houses and cooking, protecting us, you name it. And according to the head of the American 7th Fleet, without the Coast Watchers the Pacific War would not have been won. So the Papuan people were instrumental in defending Australia from a Japanese invasion. And here's some shots, of course, of the Papuans with the Allies during World War II. So much so that General MacArthur made his base for the whole of the Pacific War in West Papua, in the capital, which was then called Hollandia. During that time, over 500,000, 500,000 American troops rotated through Hollandia, through West Papua. On the other side, though, in Java, when the Japanese invaded, they were welcomed by Sukarno. He thought they were going to bring independence to the Javanese, but we know now from the records that Japan was actually aiming to incorporate the whole of the Indonesian archipelago into Greater Japan, as they were Papua and what's now Papua New Guinea. So they trained up 1.5 million young Javanese males. Not only trained them up and armed them and gave them uniforms, but they indoctrinated them into hating Europeans. And so they were very, very anti-Dutch, anti-Australian. And when World War II was over and the Dutch returned, they suddenly had this enormous new army ready to fight them, created by the Japanese. And during that time, according to historian Bernard Dahm, Sukarno used to be a socialist. In fact, the Americans were concerned that he was communist, but during the war, according to Bernard Dahm, he was so impressed with the of giving direct orders without government that he was seduced into fascism. So after World War II, the Dutch returned, and there was a war going on for about 4 years until the Security Council intervened, and they brokered the Hague Agreement. And it's a UN brokered agreement which recognises self-determination for the people of the Indonesian archipelago. That was one of the requirements. If they wanted to become part of Indonesia, they'd become part of the United States of Indonesia, or they could still retain a relationship with the Dutch, or they could be independent. That's international law under UN Resolution 15
1941.
So here we are, 1950. 1950, Indonesia gets its independence, and under UN Resolution 448, Indonesia's independence is recognised, but without West Papua. It was not part of the Indonesian independence state. And furthermore, soon after that, Sukarno proclaimed centralised control. He dropped the idea of self-determination for the 70 million people of the archipelago, and he imposed a military dictatorship. The people were denied the right to self-determination, and because it was in 1950, after the creation of the Charter of the United Nations, which still stands as international law, all the people of the Indonesian archipelago still have the right to self-determination and independence. It was brokered by the UN Security Council, and the Security Council did not uphold that agreement and safeguard the rights of self-determination of those 70 million people. West Papua was registered, here it is in the list of 1960, under Netherlands, New Guinea, just to show that it was a listed non-self-governing territory. In 1957, Australia and the Dutch were pretty progressive. They made an agreement here in Australia where they started to coordinate their administrations. There were Australian officials in West Papua and there were Dutch officials in Papua New Guinea, with the idea that they would coordinate administration until such time as the people were in a position to determine their own future, and obviously, if they wished, remove the artificial line that goes down the 141 East Meridian, which cuts through people's houses, gardens, villages, traditional lands. However, the CIA were covertly in the background, working with Sukarno, coercing him to invade West Papua so that it could become part of Indonesia, and the Americans thought that would give them a greater opportunity to access the world's largest gold deposit. 1961, the Dutch were still continuing their program of decolonisation. The people got wind that the Americans were intervening, and with Dutch support, on the 1st of December, they announced their forthcoming independence. They announced the name of their country to be called West Papua, the name of their flag to be the Morning Star flag. They had a national anthem, and they even had a embryonic system of self-governance where they had village councils, clan councils, tribal councils with over 270 autonomous tribes, then regional councils, and then a national council. So it was a system of representation based on the fabric of the indigenous people, unlike what has happened in most of the world where colonised people have had a Western centralised system imposed upon them. So by 1961, it was a non-self-governing territory. It was on the road to independence, and they even had representatives at the UN General Assembly and South Pacific Commission. This is a book by Professor Greg Polgrain, one of my fantastic supervisors, and he details in all of the covert CIA support for Suharto and for the intervention and for the transfer. It was basically, the fellow on the right was the head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, but he was also at the same time a lawyer for the Rockefellers, for the richest family in America. So he's a Wall Street lawyer working for the Rockefellers and head of the CIA at the very same time. American politics for you. A top secret dispatch which has since become accessible. It details how the United Nations Secretary General was having secret communications with Sukarno and the Netherlands to transfer the territory to the Netherlands, and that is in breach of the Charter. Under the Charter of the United Nations, the Secretary General cannot have secret negotiations or intervene in decolonisation or anything. His job is simply to be the Secretary of the United Nations. So we had the agreement. There was an agreement which the Americans wrote, one of their ambassadors, Ellsworth Bunker, And so this agreement transfers the territory from the Dutch to the United Nations for 7 months, and then from the United Nations to Indonesia. But the agreement that was put before the General Assembly for consideration is only an agreement between the Dutch and the Indonesians. So I went looking through the archives and I discovered that there was another agreement, but that agreement was never published for the members of the UN to consider. And that was an agreement between the UN and the Dutch and the Indonesians. So basically this thing was rammed through without any real consideration. And I've published a couple of papers detailing the breaches, which I'll quickly go through. So the agreement only takes note of the resolution, only takes note of the agreement. And if you look up the definition of takes note in the UN, takes note is neither approval nor disapproval. It's simply taking note of something. So the whole thing was basically illegal. Then 29th of September, the United Nations send in armed Pakistani UN security forces. And this also was out without the approval of the Security Council or the General Assembly. So that was basically an invasion by the United Nations, sending Muslim troops into what is a non-Muslim country, of course. Here we see, just for the record, 1963, and Netherlands, New Guinea is no longer on the record. Now, the only way that a country can be taken off the decolonisation list is when it has achieved a full self-governance, which is normally independence, and it can only be taken off by the General Assembly. It can't be taken off by the United Nations Secretariat. So that was another breach of international law. But they arrived. The UN came in a big fanfare, took over administration for 7 months. The people could see exactly what was happening. They protested, but the world ignored them. And anyone who tried to protest was killed or disappeared. This is a secret dispatch I came across, 1963, by Frank Galbraith, US State Department. So they were monitoring everything, of course, like all the governments were. And you can see here, perhaps the most oft-cited grievance is that the Indonesians cleaned out the shops and storehouses in the period immediately following their takeover. They went house to house, store to store, cleaned out all the shops, took children's bicycles, loaded up Air Force planes and ships, and just basically raped the country of everything they could find and took it back to Jakarta. And as you can see in the second paragraph, there were already fears of an intended genocide among the West Papuan people. And they described the Indonesian military as trigger-happy, jittery troops, ready to shoot anybody, anytime, as they continue to be today. 67, this is just after the CIA undermined Sukarno and put Suharto, one of the world's longest running military dictators, 32-year reign in Indonesia. And as soon as Suharto came to power, he was trained by the Americans in the American military schools. As soon as he came to power, the first thing he did was to give the Rockefellers the world's largest gold and copper deposit. And as I mentioned up here, in the early records, there was no mention of gold whatsoever. They only described the copper, but in actual fact, the gold is phenomenal. It's running somewhere between 15 grams upwards per tonne, which is unbelievable in gold deposits. So here we have again the State Department regarding UN representative. The UN Secretariat is basically working for the Rockefellers. So they're trying to set up an act of free choice. They call it the act of free choice. What a name. That was their name they gave to the self-determination. Now under UN Resolution 1541, an act of self-determination is universal suffrage. But as you will see in a minute, that was far from the case. The 2nd of June, we have the first reports of a slaughter going on from Reuters. And again, in another report by Frank Galbraith, they know, the Americans and obviously the West are fully aware that 85 to 90%, the greater majority of the West Papuan people, do not want to become part of Indonesia. This is my first paper detailing West Papua's legal status, published in the Griffith Law Journal in Brisbane, peer-reviewed, showing that West Papua still remains a non-self-governing territory annexed by Indonesia. And my second paper details about 34 breaches of international law. There was a 5-week delay when the United Nations released the agreement for the General Assembly to consider. They released it 48 hours before it was voted on, so the ambassadors didn't have time to send it home to their governments for consideration. That's a breach of Article 102 of the Charter. There was the collusion I mentioned between the UN and the Americans and the Netherlands. That's a breach of Article 100. The approval was never approved, breach of Article 81. As I said, the Netherlands New Guinea was illegally removed from the list of non-self-governing territory, and the Act of Self-Determination, they hand-picked just over 1,000 people out of nearly 1 million, which is 0.1%. And as you'll see, one of my informants, one West Papuan man that I interviewed, detailed how he was a young boy when that occurred, and it was just a whitewash. Again, in 1969, after that whitewash Act of Self-Determination, you have Resolution 2504, which is what the Indonesians regard as their green light to continue the occupation of West Papua. But again, it only takes note of a report, and takes note simply means we've received a report. There's never been a UN resolution recognising Indonesian sovereignty in West Papua. And that's the handbook where you can see the definitions of those various terms used in the General Assembly. So the case of genocide. We hear a lot about genocide in Gaza at the moment, as we should, and other parts of the world, but we don't hear much about what's happening on our doorstep. So what's genocide? This is the Genocide Convention. And Australia, when this was signed, when this was created in 1948, Australia was the very first country to put its hand up and to sign the Genocide Convention. We were a very progressive country back then. And these are the methods that are recognised as meeting genocide. And it only has to be one method. You don't need to have all 5, but as we'll see, we have all 5 in the case of West Papua. This is my friend Ignatius, who I interviewed up in Cape York a couple of years ago. He was an 8-year-old boy when the Act of Self-Determination occurred, and he went there with his mum to vote, and everyone was forced at gunpoint. Then he was forced to work as slave labour, building Indonesian military bases in his area of Merauke on the south coast. And he said people would simply be shot if they complained about the theft of their land. And he ran away. He eventually came to Australia and sought refuge in Australia. Around the Freeport gold mine, that was kicking off in 1967. They flew the first bulldozers up into the highlands to start clearing the mountains and bring a road down. And as you can see, the Indonesian military, this is just one example of the way they treat the West Papuan people. And in that area alone, they detail 42,000 plus people. These people were basically bombed using American Bronco jets, ex-Vietnam Bronco jets, which they gave free of charge to Indonesia, and the Indonesians blanket bombed all the villages around the Freeport gold mine so they could clear the land and get access to the gold. And from some of my informants, there were Americans on the ground running that operation. The Indonesians were not capable of running those Bronco jets themselves. Just some examples, mass burial graves all over West Papua. They're slowly being documented. I'm not allowed to show you this footage because it's too graphic, but I'll tell you what it is. It's a young man, Defianus Kagoya, and the Indonesians murdered him by torture. They bashed him in the left-hand video, and in the right-hand video they sliced his body open using bayonets. And of course the Indonesians, then they share this stuff amongst themselves on social media, and that's the only way we're able to get access sometimes to these sorts of videos. I am allowed to show you this because we're not seeing anything quite so graphic. This is typical of what happens day in, day out in West Papua. They just fly around indiscriminately, shooting at people. They're too scared to go on the ground. This is detailed in the Saturday paper, the use of phosphorus bombs, which is illegal. Phosphorus burns through your skin down to your bone. Another method of genocide is forcibly removing children from their families, from their communities. And it's a great pastime of the Indonesian military and the rich to go up to Papuan families and say, hey, give us your children, we'll sponsor them and give them a good education. And some people, of course, think it's going to be okay. But as Michael Batchelard of the Sydney Morning Herald discovered, he went over to Java and he travelled around for weeks and weeks and weeks, and he found these Islamic fundamentalist schools being indoctrinated into Islam. They're not being taught maths or science or anything. They're just reading the Quran. Then they're sent back over to West Papua to carry on the same program. This is 1998, the Biak massacre, one of the few massacres that are well documented, and that's because the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney, where I used to work, we organised a public tribunal. That is where you get professional barristers and judges and you hold your own court case, and we had funding to bring over victims of the Biak massacre. It was in 1998, and if you remember, that was when we had the fall of Suharto. The dictator fell, and Indonesia, for a very, very short period of time, was in an elevated mood, and people thought they were going to get their rightful independence. The West Papuan people raised the Morning Star flag in their town, and the military came out and machine gunned everybody and then dragged everyone off into ships, mutilated women, and threw all their bodies overboard, and bodies washed up for weeks and weeks to come. Here we are, Radio New Zealand. This is 2020, one of the few reports detailing the sweeping operations in the highlands. And there are now hundreds of thousands of people who have been internally displaced, and at least 10,000, probably a lot more, who've run across the border, albeit many weeks trekking across to Papua New Guinea seeking refuge. And so, yeah, we've been finding lots of mass graves in that region. Poisoning is Indonesia's favourite method of killing anyone who's slightly preeminent or well known. On the left is a famous human rights reporter, Jonas Dow. He was poisoned last year. And my dear friend, filmmaker Mark Worth, I discovered when I was over there in 2024, I found his grave with the help of a Polish journalist that was there. And then I found his family. I interviewed his father-in-law. Was married to a West Papuan lady. And I interviewed his brother-in-law, and they detailed how he was murdered. What happened was ABC was about to show his documentary, and they didn't tell Mark that they had brought the film forward 1 month to January instead of February, and he was still over there. The Indonesians obviously saw the trailers to the movie, realised that Mark was still in West Papua. He went to fly out. As soon as he realised the film was brought forward, they cancelled his plane, saying it was broken down, put him in a hotel room, and while he was in the hotel room, he was murdered, poisoned. The Indonesians love taking trophy shots of Papuans as if they're wild animals or something. Another one. And the one in the middle is the current president, and he is General Prabowo. He is wanted for war crimes in East Timor, war crimes in West Papua, war crimes in Kalimantan, in Borneo. He is one of the greatest war criminals this world has seen, and he's currently the president of Indonesia. Peter King from the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, he quotes General Ryakudus, another famous shocking general. And these Indonesian military, it's almost funny in that they're not afraid to just tell the truth and say how it is. Without the military, West Papua would be independent tomorrow, and without the military, Indonesia would fall apart tomorrow. So they see themselves as the glue of the nation. Some reports, just a few. This is the University of Sydney, West Papua Project, detailing genocide, 2005. Another one from Yale Law School, detailing genocide. One from the Griffith Law Journal in Brisbane, where Cami and Jim go through and show that it's not just the active killing or the act of genocide, but it's also done with government intent. That's one of the important things under the definition of genocide, is to show that it's not just arbitrary killing, it's done with government intent, government approval. And they quote these various generals and leaders who make these most incredible statements. If you want independence, you can go and live on the moon. If you vote for independence, you'll have your tongues cut out. This is from the leaders of Indonesia. So their paper is very important. Multiple papers on, there's even one here from the United Nations. This is the Economic and Social Council, and they detail that what is happening is genocide. And yet, the United Nations did not, the Economic and Social Council, as I'll explain, has a legal obligation to put this case to the International Criminal Court and to the General Assembly and particularly the Security Council, but they failed to do so. Western complicity, and this is where we come to our involvement. If you conspire to commit genocide, attempt to commit, or if you're anyway complicit, and as you'll see, we are very complicit. So persons committing genocide, they must be punished under Article 4, and that includes rulers, public officials and private individuals. So, Australia, we supply helicopter gunships, part of the genocide program. We train the Indonesian military here on our soil. We created, can you believe, Australia created Detachment 88, which is the most notorious death squad in Indonesia. It murders not just West Papuans, it murders anyone who the government doesn't like. I was in Bali a few years ago and I got speaking to a guy with a small resort, and just opposite were the oil facilities where they store their oil on Bali. And he described to me how in the 80s they came in and just massacred the entire village in Bali because the people refused to give up their land. So Australia is responsible for creating this death squad. And our wonderful so-called representative is over there signing new agreements. And from the bit that I've seen, they are looking to have Indonesian troops in Australia and Australian troops in Indonesia. A very, very bad scenario. Not just Australia, Germany. They give Leopard tanks. Britain gives armoured personnel carriers and fighter jets. America gives them free F-16s. And on social media, we've come across posts from the Indonesians showing American soldiers in Indonesia. And from some of the photos, I think they are in West Papua. It's not just the UN and the Western governments, it's also the World Bank. The World Bank sponsors the transmigration program, and this is where the Indonesians have now brought over about 2.5 million Javanese, mostly Javanese and Sulawesi. They clear vast tracts of land, as you can see there, and each of those white dots is a tin house. That's a brand new house that they've built for the new settlers. They give them chickens, they give them goats, they give them farming tools, and they kick the Papuans off their land. So, Pathways to Freedom, I've just had another paper published. It hasn't come out yet, but it's in the process, and it details the simple processes for West Papua to get its rightful freedom. But what the problem is with our international law is that only member states of the UN have access to the courts. If you're an Indigenous person in West Papua, or anywhere else for that matter, you cannot access the international legal system. Even if you're being slaughtered, you rely on a member, a sympathetic member state, to take up your case, and that is the problem we have here. The International Court of Justice is how East Timor got its independence. It's portrayed that they got their independence by the vote, but in actual fact, Portugal took Australia to the International Court of Justice because we were the only country to recognise Indonesian sovereignty in East Timor in exchange for the oil. And so Portugal took us to court. We lost the court case. The International Court ruled that East Timor was still a non-self-governing territory entitled to independence, and that's what forced the Indonesians to have an act of self-determination in 1999. The Security Council, obviously they should intervene. And the Trusteeship Council, these are all mechanisms within the UN, but again, they rely on a member to actually take up the initiative, and the General Assembly. And Article 4 of the Charter says that when you sign up or when you apply to join the United Nations, you must abide by the Charter, and you must uphold that international law. But as we know, that law is lacking. All member states are in breach of international law. The only legal mechanism, if that's the right word, it's not really a legal mechanism, but the only thing which in paper helps the West Papuans is they have the right under UN Resolution 2621, the Programme of Action, they have the right to struggle by all means necessary at their disposal. And as I will show you, they are for the most part fighting with these traditional bows and arrows. That resolution implores member states to go to the assistance of those territories and provide material and moral and material assistance. But again, that's lacking. All we get is a bit of lip service occasionally from Solomons or Vanuatu about human rights violations, but no one is speaking up as yet for the right to their freedom and independence. So, the obligation to act, all UN members are aware of the genocide. It's in multiple reports, it's in intelligence reports. They all have a legal obligation to act. Even the Melanesian states are only paying lip service. And Article 1 of the Convention demands that they act to prevent genocide, and Australia, of course, and other Western countries are aiding and abetting in that genocide. So the OPM, the Free Papua Movement, these are the people that I've been studying in great detail. In 1965, when they realised they didn't have a hope of getting their independence once the Indonesians moved in, they slowly set up 36 regional commands across the country. This is their constitution, which I think is worth looking at. It's apart from being independent, they want a people's government. They reject the notion of Western governance. They want a popular democracy where everyone participates, and armed forces arming the masses, equal distribution of the wealth, decentralisation of power, rejecting the imperial, centrally controlled economic and government political system. And they want to also support other oppressed, colonised peoples. I think that's a really beautiful constitution. This is their system of organisation. I won't go through it, but it is available. And Professor Peter King and Otto Wandawame detail how the OPM is the only organisation that's operated since '65, aiming to bring independence to the people. So I want to show you some footage quickly, just of how beautiful the country is. I was fortunate to go over there twice. The first time was I flew into the highlands, into the Leopold Ranges, and we were met by a group of OPM guerrilla fighters who then took us across the border and took me around their beautiful country for 3 weeks. This airstrip up in Tumabil, it took the local people 7 years to build. It took them 7 years to cut their own airstrip. Quite phenomenal. Just shows you what you can do when you've got a pick and shovel and a lot of community effort. And then we kicked off and we trekked. This is the headwaters of the Sepik River. We trekked across into West Papua and they showed me around their beautiful country. Magnificent hand-built bridges. And for the most part, we were trekking on the tiniest of roads to avoid Indonesian observation. Indonesians fly around in helicopters looking for anyone to shoot, really. So most of the time we would walk at night, or we would walk in these very, very tiny tracks, often straight up creeks. This is having an early morning breakfast in a traditional Papuan house before we head off for a very long trek. Here we left at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we trekked till about 7 o'clock that day, walking by torch until morning, of course, often just to avoid the Indonesians. The boys love smoking cannabis. Just put a clip in there. And they're all brothers and sisters and cousins. It's all just one big family, so they all look after each other, cut each other's hair. And even though they're in what would you call the most dire straits, they never stop laughing. They're the happiest people I've ever come across. And they make these incredible handmade tracks through the jungle. You can imagine how long that took to make. And this is going up to one of their bases. They took me up to show their headquarters up on top of a mountain. The forest is just virgin forest, the most beautiful forest, thick jungle. And here we are. We got into a valley which is occupied by the OPM freedom fighters. The Indonesians are too afraid to come into this valley, so we were able to celebrate for 3 days. That's in the Star Mountains. And they only put their uniforms on for special occasions. The rest of the time they're in shorts and singlets. And as you can see, they're mostly armed with bows and arrows and a few broken guns and the odd modern gun that they've managed to capture off the Indonesians. And as you can see, that Islamic tableau, my dear friend who was killed late last year in the middle. And those guns you can see there, they're handmade shotguns. They make their own guns when they can, raising their treasured Morning Star flag. And cooking, huge feasts. This is what you might call a mumu in Papua New Guinea, bakabatu, cooking with rocks. So they make a huge bonfire, they make the stones really, really hot, they wrap the food up in banana leaves, put it back in with the hot rocks, cover it up, and cook it for 4 or 8 hours, depending. And then it's the women's job to
cooking the fur,
scrape the meat, and then wrap it up and prepare it for the feast. This is the Indonesian military base you can see in the middle there, called Kiwi Rock, and this is where the Indonesians, there's about 300 to 400 of them. This is where they fly their helicopter gunships and drop bombs on the villages around them.
They they were witness to.
And these are some of the unexploded bombs.
Yes. But they...
Abandoned villages. All the villages in that region have been abandoned, and the people have left their houses, gone up into the mountains, made makeshift accommodation in the mountains, and they only come down to harvest their gardens, because their gardens are still full of food, but they're too afraid to stay in their houses in case they're bombed. And that's Julian, one of the young guerrilla fighters, showing me where his house has been destroyed. And yeah, these were some of the guys that were so kind to show me around for 3 weeks. They're all 18, 22, 28. Some have left university to come home and fight when they heard the Indonesians were dropping bombs. They mostly got bows and arrows, and they had one broken gun between them with 3 bullets. And everyone pleaded and pleaded and pleaded, couldn't you please help us?
Papua, merdeka, merdeka, merdeka. Papua, merdeka, merdeka, merdeka. Papua, merdeka, merdeka, merdeka. Indonesia, no. No. Indonesia, no. Indonesia, no. Indonesia, no. Papua, merdeka, merdeka, merdeka.
So it's the BEC's campaign. Bellingen Environment Centre have been very kind to support West Papua. We have donated probably about $2,000 so far to the campaign in Ghana. Just by some freak of coincidence, this Ghanaian reggae artist who contacted me through Facebook and read my papers about West Papua and said, Ghana, we're really big supporters of West Papua. So being a famous reggae artist, he was able to speak to the President, speak to the Foreign Affairs Department, speak to the, they have a unique constitution where they have a council of paramount chiefs, and those chiefs can make decisions which the government must honour. And so he says that the paramount chiefs are all on board to support West Papua's case. So we are hoping very much that the government of Ghana will do the right thing, uphold international law, and bring West Papua's case to the relevant agencies, the International Court of Justice for a legal opinion and the International Criminal Court for the case of genocide. And that's Jomo on the right there.
Give it up for Julian McKinlay King. Fundraiser for today is for our Ghanaian representation in the International Justice Court and the International Criminal Court. But please support Julian, and you can have a chat to him in the break to find out where to donate to his GoFundMe campaign.